The heavy iron gates of the St. James estate creaked open, but I didn't look back at the grand manor that had once been my prison. I stood by the curb, watching a sleek black car pull up to take me to the airport. Across the lawn, standing near the withered rose bushes my mother had once loved, were Killian and Saskia. They looked older, their faces etched with the kind of desperation that only comes when the bank takes everything you thought you owned. Killian took a step toward me, his hand outstretched, his voice a pathetic rasp. "Odette, please, the children, they don't deserve to lose their home. You have millions, just help us one last time." I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel joy. I felt a hollow, crystalline peace. I adjusted my silk scarf and looked him dead in the eye. "I already helped them, Killian. I paid for their futures so they would never have to grow up to be like you. But as for this house, and for you, I am already gone." I stepped into the car, leaving them to the silence of a legacy they had burned down with their own hands. Before I became the woman the world knows today, I was simply Odette St. James, the girl who lived in the shadow of the staircase. My childhood felt like a masterpiece painted in warm watercolors. My father, a man of immense kindness and quiet wealth, used to tell me that our family name stood for integrity. We lived in a sprawling estate filled with leather-bound books, velvet curtains, and the constant scent of pipe tobacco and old paper. I was the child of his second marriage, a late blessing, he called me. My half-siblings, Killian and Saskia, were much older, already adults by the time I was learning to ride a bike. Back then, the mask of the family was perfect. Killian would bring me expensive dolls from his travels, and Saskia would braid my hair while telling me stories of the grand balls our ancestors attended. I grew up believing I was part of a fortress, protected by blood and bond. My father had built a life of security, and I was the jewel in the center of it. Every Sunday, we sat for dinner, the silver polished, the laughter genuine, or so I thought. I didn't know that beneath the mahogany table, my siblings were already counting the silver and measuring the acreage, waiting for the heart of the house to stop beating so they could begin the harvest. The fairy tale shattered on a Tuesday in November. My father passed away in his sleep, and within 48 hours, the warm watercolors of my life were washed away by a cold, relentless gray. I was barely 20, still a student, still mourning the man who was my entire world. I expected us to grieve together. Instead, I found Killian and Saskia in my father's study, surrounded by stacks of legal documents before the funeral tea had even gone cold. Their faces had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. When the lawyer arrived for the reading of the will, I sat in the back, clutching my mother's handkerchief. I expected a fair distribution, a continuation of the life my father promised. But as the words were read, my blood turned to ice. According to the document in the lawyer's hand, a document dated just 3 weeks before my father's death, I had been left nothing but a small monthly allowance and a directive to vacate the estate within 30 days. The main inheritance, the properties, the stocks, and the St. James name itself had been signed over entirely to Killian and Saskia. They looked at me not with sympathy, but with a cold, triumphant disdain. "Father realized at the end that you were always a bit indulgent, Odette," Saskia whispered, her voice like a serrated blade. "He wanted the legacy in capable hands, not with a girl who only knows how to spend." The red flags had been there all along, but I had been too blinded by love to see them. I remembered the way Killian would hover over my father's desk during his final illness, insisting on helping him with his signatures. I remembered the whispered conversations that ended the moment I entered a room, and the way Saskia had started sorting through my mother's jewelry months before, claiming she was just getting things appraised for insurance. But the most chilling realization came a week after the funeral. I went to the attic to gather my childhood photo albums and the heirloom quilts my mother had made for me. I found the trunk, but it was empty. In the backyard, near the old oak tree, I saw a pile of ash. My siblings hadn't just taken the money. They were trying to erase my history. They had burned my photos, my journals, and the physical proof that I had ever belonged in that house. "We're cleaning out the clutter, Odette," Killian said, leaning against the doorway as I knelt by the ashes. "Since you aren't legally a primary heir, there's no need for you to keep souvenirs of a life that no longer belongs to you. You're a greedy girl for even asking. Just take your bags and go. You're lucky we're giving you anything at all." The discovery of the depth of their betrayal happened on my final night in the house. I was looking for a misplaced passport in the library when I found a hidden folder tucked behind a row of encyclopedias. It contained the original draft of my father's will, the real one. In his true handwriting, he had left me 40% of the estate, including a trust fund intended for me to start my own business. There were also medical records from his final weeks, showing he was under heavy sedation administered by a private nurse Killian had hired. They hadn't just changed the will, they had manufactured a slow, chemical silence to get his thumbprint on a forged document. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by iron bands. I stood in the dark library, realizing that the people I called brother and sister were effectively my father's executioners and my life's thieves. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run to the police. But I looked at the forged document and realized they had covered their tracks perfectly. The lawyer was in their pocket, the nurse was gone, and I was a penniless girl with no proof but a draft that could easily be called a fake. I was on the verge of a breakdown, staring at the dark gardens, feeling the weight of a bridge that had been burned behind me. I spent that night in a daze, the thought of ending it all crossing my mind like a dark shadow. If my family was a lie, what was the point of the truth? But as I watched the sunrise over the estate one last time, a cold, hard ember ignited in my chest. Killian and Saskia thought they had won because they had the house and the gold. They didn't realize that the most valuable thing my father gave me wasn't in the will. It was his mind for business and his eye for detail. I packed my single suitcase, leaving behind the ashes of my childhood. I didn't sue them. I didn't beg. I walked out of those gates with a silent vow. I would let them have the past, because I was going to own the future. I moved into a tiny, cramped studio in the city, working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. I didn't spend a penny of the meager allowance they sent me. I saved it, using it as the seed for my own quiet revolution. My revenge wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't involve lawyers or shouting matches. It would be built on the very thing they tried to destroy, my name. I started a small business from my kitchen table, drawing on the only things I had left, my memories of the Grand St. James archives. I started a boutique service called the Heritage Guard. I specialized in the physical preservation and digital archiving of family legacies for the ultra-wealthy. I knew how the rich valued their history, because I had lost mine. I worked 18 hours a day, meticulously restoring old letters, digitizing fragile photos, and creating legacy vaults for families who wanted to ensure their children never suffered the erasure I did. I was a ghost in the industry at first, but slowly, word spread. The girl with the white gloves became a legend among the elite. My client list grew to include senators, tech moguls, and old money dynasties. While Killian and Saskia were busy spending their inheritance on fleeting luxuries, yachts, bad investments, and high-stakes gambling, I was building a financial empire built on the preservation of truth. 10 years passed. I changed my last name legally to St. James Rhodes, adding a layer of distance between me and the siblings who shared my blood, but not my soul. I became a millionaire in my own right, but I stayed out of the social columns. I watched from the shadows as Killian's innovative ventures failed one after another. I watched as Saskia's 3rd marriage collapsed, taking half of her remaining wealth with it. They were hemorrhaging money, desperate to maintain a lifestyle they hadn't earned. The St. James estate, once the crown jewel of the county, began to fall into disrepair. The roof leaked, the gardens turned to weeds, and the debts mounted. They were drowning, and they didn't even know that I was the one who owned the water. Through a series of anonymous holding companies, I began buying up their debts. Every bank loan they took, every mortgage they defaulted on, eventually landed on my desk. I didn't foreclose, not yet. I wanted them to feel the slow, creeping dread of being helped by a ghost. The most delicious part of my plan involved their children. Killian had a son, and Saskia had a daughter. These children knew nothing of the theft that had funded their early years. They only knew that their parents were failing, and that their dreams of university and a stable life were slipping away. Anonymously, through a foundation I created, I reached out to them. I offered them full, unrestricted scholarships to the best universities in the world. I paid for their housing, their books, and their internships. The only condition was that the donors must remain strictly confidential, and that the children were never to mention the funding to their parents until they had graduated. I wasn't doing it to be a saint. I was doing it to ensure that the next generation of St. Jameses grew up with a debt of gratitude to the truth, rather than a debt of loyalty to liars. I watched them flourish from afar, young adults with integrity and ambition, miles away from the rot of their parents' greed. By the time the final collapse came, the siblings were desperate. They were weeks away from being thrown onto the street. They had reached out to everyone they knew, but the friends they had bought with my father's money had vanished long ago. They were alone in that cold, crumbling house, surrounded by the ghosts of the things they had stolen. It was time for the final act. I arranged a family reunion at the manor. They thought a wealthy, distant relative had finally come to save them. They cleaned the house as best they could, putting on their moth-eaten finery, waiting in the foyer with practiced smiles. When I walked through the door, the air left the room. They didn't recognize me at first. The thin, grieving girl was gone, replaced by a woman of power and poise. But when I spoke, the realization hit them like a physical blow. "Hello, Killian." "Hello, Saskia. It's been a long time since we sat in this library, hasn't it?" I didn't wait for them to speak. I walked to my father's old desk and sat in his chair. I laid out the documents, the deeds to the house, the debt clearances for their children's education, and the proof of the forged will I had spent a decade legally authenticating in the background. I showed them that I owned the ground they stood on and the air they breathed. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I simply told them the truth. I have spent 10 years building what you tried to burn. I have saved your children from the poverty you earned for them. And now, I am going to let you stay in this house, but not as owners. You will stay here as tenants of my foundation, living on a modest stipend. Exactly the amount you once tried to trap me with. The look of absolute, soul-crushing guilt on their faces was better than any court verdict. They had to live with the knowledge that the girl they called greedy was the only reason they weren't homeless. They had to look at their successful children every day and know that their success was a gift from the sister they had tried to erase. I stood up, ready to leave the past behind for good, the heavy iron gates of my heart finally swinging open. The silence in the room after my revelation was more deafening than any explosion. Killian and Saskia stood paralyzed, their faces a frantic map of confusion, shame, and sudden, terrifying realization. They looked at the mahogany desk, the very desk where they had once guided my father's sedated hand to sign away my life. And then they looked at me. I wasn't the broken girl they had tossed out into the rain with a single suitcase. I was the architect of their final reality. I let the silence stretch, watching the weight of 10 years of lies settle onto their shoulders, until Saskia finally found her voice, though it was nothing more than a brittle whisper. You've been the one, all those years. The anonymous grants for the kids, the bank extensions? Why, Odette? After what we did, why would you help us? I stood up from my father's chair, smoothed my skirt, and walked toward the tall library windows that overlooked the overgrown gardens. I didn't help you, Saskia, I said, my back turned to them. I helped the St. James name. I helped 2 innocent children who carry my blood, so they wouldn't have to pay for the sins of parents who value paper over people. As for the bank extensions, I didn't want you to lose the house too early. I wanted you to stay here long enough to watch it crumble. I wanted you to feel the walls closing in, just as I did. I turned around, and the expression on my face was one of clinical indifference. There is no greater prison than a home you cannot afford, maintained by a sister you tried to destroy. The psychological dismantling of Killian was even swifter. He had always been the one who prided himself on his business acumen, the one who mocked my indulgent nature. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the final set of documents, the original, unsedated medical reports and the testimony from the nurse I had spent 3 years tracking down in Europe. The police have been notified, Killian, I said quietly, but I told them I wouldn't press charges for the forgery. Not because I forgive you, but because a trial would be too quick. If you go to prison, you become a martyr in your own mind. But if you stay here, in this house, knowing that every meal you eat and every light you turn on is paid for by the greedy girl you threw away, that is a life sentence you can't escape. The following months were a masterclass in the quiet power of reclaimed dignity. I didn't move back into the estate. Why would I? That house was a graveyard of memories, and I had already built a palace of my own. Instead, I turned the St. James Manor into a headquarters for my foundation. Killian and Saskia were allowed to live in the small servants' wing, the irony of which was lost on no one. They were given a modest stipend, exactly the amount of the allowance they had once allotted me. They had to watch as I brought in professional restorers to fix the roof they had neglected, and landscapers to revive the roses they had let die. They were spectators in their own lives, ghosts haunting the halls of a legacy they no longer owned. The real climax, however, wasn't the financial takeover. It was the emotional one. Graduation day for Killian's son and Saskia's daughter arrived. It was a sun-drenched afternoon at an Ivy League university, a scene of pure, unadulterated success. I sat in the front row, invited as the guest of honor by the students themselves. Killian and Saskia were there too, sitting 3 rows back, looking uncomfortable in their dated clothes, avoided by the wealthy parents they once tried to emulate. When the children stood on the podium to deliver their thank you speeches, they didn't mention their parents' hard work or sacrifice. They looked directly at me. "We grew up in a house of shadows," Killian's son told the crowd, his voice booming with a strength his father never possessed. "But we were saved by a light we didn't recognize until now." To our aunt, Odette Street, James Rhodes, "Thank you for teaching us that a family's true inheritance isn't gold or land, but the courage to tell the truth. Thank you for being the bridge when our own foundations were rotting." The applause was thunderous. I saw Killian flinch as if he had been struck. I saw Saskia bury her face in her hands. In that moment, the revenge was complete. I hadn't just taken their money. I had taken their children's respect. I had shown the next generation that the St. James name didn't belong to the thieves. It belonged to the survivor. As the ceremony ended, the children ran to me, hugging me, ignoring their parents who stood awkwardly on the periphery. Killian tried to approach, perhaps to piggyback on my success one last time, but his own son stepped in front of him. "Not today, Dad," the boy said, his eyes cold. "Odette told us everything. We've seen the real will. We've seen the medical reports." The look of absolute defeat on Killian's face was the final payment on the debt he owed me. He realized then that he hadn't just lost the house, he had lost the future. He was a man with no legacy, standing in the shadow of a woman he thought he had erased. I spent the next year traveling, focusing on my business and expanding my foundation to help other disinherited women. I wrote my story, not as a tell-all scandal, but as a manual for financial and emotional independence. I called it The Architect of Silence. I wanted girls to understand that when someone tries to take your past, you don't fight them for the ashes, you go out and build a sun. I became a speaker for women's empowerment, often standing on stages and looking out at thousands of faces that had been told they were less than or unstable by the people who were supposed to love them. I visited the estate one last time on the anniversary of my father's death. I didn't go inside to see my siblings. I went to the backyard, to the old oak tree where they had burned my photos 10 years ago. I sat on a bench I had installed there, a simple stone seat dedicated to my mother. The grass was green, the air was sweet, and for the first time, the memory of the fire didn't hurt. I realized that by burning my photos, they hadn't erased my history. They had just cleared the space for me to write a much better story. I was no longer the victim of their greed. I was the master of my own fate. The sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. I saw Saskia watching me from a window in the servants' wing. She looked like a prisoner staring through bars. I didn't wave. I didn't acknowledge her. I simply stood up, adjusted my coat, and walked toward my car. I had done what I set out to do. I had reclaimed my name. I had secured the future of the innocent, and I had left the guilty to the only thing they had left, each other. The St. James legacy was finally clean, scrubbed of the rot and the lies, and I was the one holding the keys. This story is a reminder to every girl who feels like she's being pushed out or told she doesn't belong. Your value is not determined by a piece of paper or a family's approval. They can take your house, they can take your money, and they can even burn your memories, but they can never take the mind that God gave you. Don't waste your life trying to prove your worth to people who are determined to misread you. Instead, go out and build something so big, so successful, and so silent that they have no choice but to watch you from the sidelines of the life they thought they stole. Revenge isn't about getting even. It's about getting so far ahead that you can't even see them in your rearview mirror. As I drive away from the iron gates for the last time, I leave you with a question. If the people you trusted most took everything from you today, would you spend your life trying to get it back? Or would you have the courage to start from zero and build something they could never touch? Is your identity tied to what you own, or to who you are when you have nothing? Let your success be the noise that drowns out their lies. Your life is your own masterpiece. Don't let anyone else hold the brush.